Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to talk to you about my favorite books that I read in the fall. In this video, I'm going to go over all of the books that I read during the fall. So for me, that includes the months of September, October, and November. I go over them from lowest rating to highest rating, and I'll talk more in depth about my top 5 favorite books of the season. I'll link the 3 monthly wrap-ups that I did for the fall down in the description box, so if you want more information on my thoughts on some of these books that I'm not going in depth into, you can check it out in those monthly wrap-ups. I'll also include timestamps so that you guys can jump around the video and watch the parts that you're most interested in. So in the fall, I read a total of 12 books. I had 2 books that I rated 3 stars. I had 6 books that I rated 4 stars. And I had 4 books that I rated 5 stars. So overall, I had a really great reading season. That's a lot of 4 stars. And I didn't have any books that I rated below 3 stars. So that's fantastic. Out of these 12 books, I did have 2 that were rereads. They were both for my Readalong or Wheel of Time read-along that I am currently co-hosting. My rereads are not eligible for like my top 5 spots, so I'm just going to tell you what they were right now. In October, I read Crossroads of Twilight by Robert Jordan, which is the 10th book in the Wheel of Time series, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And in September, I read Winter's Heart, which is the 9th book in the Wheel of Time series, and I gave that one 5 out of 5 stars. Taking out these rereads, that left me with 5 4-star books and 3 5-star books that were eligible for my top 5 spots. So obviously 3 of them were my 5-star books, but I had to pick 2 out of 5 4-star books to include as my top 5, and that was actually a really hard choice for me. Anyways, let me just start from the beginning and go over my lowest rated books to my highest rated books. One of my 3-star reads was My Plain Jane by the Lady Jamies, which includes Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. I also read Our Dark Duet by Victoria Schwab, and I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Getting into my 4-star books, at the bottom I have The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly. I have World War Z by Max Brooks. And then I have Vicious by V.E. Schwab, which I was very tempted to include into my top 5 list, but the other 2 4-star books beat it out by just this much. Alright, now on to my actual top 5 reads from the fall. The first 4-star book to make it to my top 5 for the fall is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kiersten White. The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein is, as you might guess from the title, a Frankenstein retelling. I have read the original Frankenstein. I had to read it when I was in high school. By this point, that was a long time ago, and I honestly didn't remember a whole lot about the original story. While I don't think it's necessary at all to have read the original Frankenstein to enjoy this book, I think me having read it previously still added to my appreciation of it. The main character of the story is Elizabeth Frankenstein. As a young girl, Elizabeth was adopted by the Frankenstein family because they were looking for a companion or a friend for their son, Victor Frankenstein. Victor is not a normal child. He has some violent tendencies and has a hard time making friends and getting along with people. And so the Frankensteins are hoping that by adopting Elizabeth and bringing her into the family, she can help Victor through some of those difficulties. And prior to being adopted by the Frankenstein, Elizabeth was an orphan and was being raised by like this abusive older woman, and so being adopted by the Frankensteins was definitely an improvement in her life. As Elizabeth grows up, she becomes very close with Victor, but at the same time is very acutely aware that she only has a place in this family because of Victor's need for her, and if at any point he, for some reason, doesn't need her around anymore, that she very well might just get put back on the street. The main timeline of the story is told when Elizabeth is 18 and Victor is a little bit older, so when they are, young adult age. But it's also interspersed with a lot of flashbacks into Elizabeth's past, so you can kind of see how they got to where they are. What I really loved about the story is the complexity of Elizabeth. And that was no surprise to me because I know that Kiersten White is amazing when it comes to creating complex characters. This book definitely had a lot of feminist aspects to it in the sense that even though in this time period women don't have a lot of rights, and in many ways Elizabeth was very trapped in her life, there were situations where she had agency and was making choices, and it all came down to trying to survive for Elizabeth. Something that I realized I didn't talk about in my wrap-up of this book is that one of the things that I really liked about it was also the ending of the book. The ending is actually really open-ended, and it's one of those endings that makes you wonder like, what just happened there? And while usually open-ended endings don't work for me, this one I actually really liked. If you're a fan of the original Frankenstein, if you like complex characters, if you're looking for a spooky, Halloween-y type of book, this is one that I definitely recommend. The next 4-star book that made it to my top 5 list is Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. This was my first Claire Legrand book, and I definitely want to read more books from her. Sawkill Girls is what I would consider to be like an urban fantasy or maybe like a paranormal story because it's set in what seems to be our world on a fictional island, but there's definitely magic and monsters involved. The story centers around 3 different girls. One of these girls moves to this island called Sawkill, and there's something that's been going on this island for the past whatever years, like a long time, where occasionally girls are going missing. So while the story starts out as kind of a mystery, it very quickly turns into a paranormal story with some very strange things going on. This book is definitely diverse with a female-female romance as well as an on-page asexual character. I also found it to be super atmospheric and was very creepy. I mean, I'm someone who likes scary things, so it didn't scare me, but I definitely was getting a lot of spooky vibes, and I think for some people, this book might toe the line between thriller and horror. This book had a lot of feminist themes and was just really unique and atmospheric, and overall, I just really loved it. I'm definitely going to be checking out more Claire Legrand in the future. And now we're on to my 5-star reads. The first one I'm going to talk about is The Glass Castle by Jeannette Walls. The Glass Castle is a memoir, and I actually listened to this on audiobook, which is of course narrated by Jeannette Walls, and I absolutely love that experience. Jeannette Walls grew up in a very unconventional family. She grew up very poor, and the book is mostly about her childhood and some of the things that she had to go through, but also a little bit about her adulthood and how she got to where she is. This book is really hard to describe because it's about a lot of things. I mean, it's mostly just about her life, but it made me think about a lot of things. Her parents in this book, well, I guess her parents in real life, are very smart people, but are also selfish and suffered from some problems with addiction. I would definitely give some content warnings for this book for alcoholism, sexual abuse, and like living in poverty. And all of those things were hard for me to read as someone who hasn't really dealt with any of those things. Even though her parents had all of these problems, Jeannette Walls also portrays them in a way that you can see that they still loved their children, they just showed their love in a different way. And that's really hard for me to say because the way that these kids grew up was definitely not a good situation, but by the end of the book, you could still see that her parents loved her and that she loved them too, even though they had all of these really difficult things that had happened to them in their past. I don't know, the book was just really complex. Of course, it made me cry. I mean, I'm an easy crier, but this book had me sobbing at the end. I recently watched the movie as well, and while it wasn't the greatest adaptation, I think it still really got the point of the book across. The movie had me sobbing, and one thing that I loved about the movie was at the end of the movie, there were actually like video clips and pictures from Jeannette Walls' real life and real parents, so that was kind of cool to see. But yeah, even though this book was showing how terrible of a childhood Jeannette Walls had, it also was about family and resilience and not giving up, and that even though sometimes terrible things happen within families, that doesn't mean that there's no love there. I don't know if I'm really saying what I want to say, but I think this book really conveys how complex family relationships can be, and I appreciated that. Okay, let's move on. My next 5-star book that I'm going to talk about is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Oh my gosh, this book was so good. This is, of course, another memoir. I listened to this exclusively on audio, which is narrated by Trevor Noah, and I highly recommend the audiobook because he narrates it so well. I was already a fan of Trevor Noah. I don't watch his TV show like every day, but I watch clips of it on YouTube, and I think he's really funny. And so I was already a fan of him, and I was really looking forward to reading this book. This book really focuses on Trevor Noah's childhood and not so much things that happened to him in his adult life or like how he got famous or anything like that. It's really about his childhood and how when he was born, his life itself was a crime because he was born during apartheid. I hadn't known that much about apartheid. Like, I knew what it was, but I've never really read about it too much, and reading about it from a person who has lived it and who is just a little bit older than me was really interesting and definitely gave me a different perspective on apartheid. The book also talks a lot about Trevor Noah's mother, and she is a fascinating person. She was definitely ahead of her time in many different aspects. Even though Trevor Noah is not that much older than me, he's definitely had a super interesting life and has had a lot of crazy things happen to him. Some of them were really terrible things, but even the terrible things he was able to put a positive spin on, or put a, maybe not a positive spin, but he was able to convey a message with these stories that on the one hand was very profound, but at the same time had me laughing really hard. In addition to laughing really hard, this book made me sob really hard. Like I said, I am an easy crier, so that might not mean much, but emotionally, I was put through the ringer, especially at the end of this book, and I loved everything about this book. I highly recommend it. If you like memoirs, if you're interested in Trevor Noah at all, definitely go and read this book. I loved it so much. It made me laugh, it made me cry, it was so good, and I definitely recommend it. The last book on my top 5, so my favorite book that I read this fall, is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. When I originally filmed my wrap-up clip for this book, I actually gave it a 4-star rating, but then while I was editing my wrap-up video, I came back and was like, no, looking back on it, I think this is a 5-star book, and now, looking back on it, I'm like, what was I thinking? Of course this is a 5-star book. It was definitely my favorite book that I read in the last 3 months. So Spinning Silver is a loose Rumpelstiltskin retelling, so it's an adult fantasy. It's set in a Russian-inspired world, so there's a king who's called a Tsar. It takes place like exclusively in winter, and there are a type of fae in this book called the Starik. The way that they're described reminds me very much of the way the White Walkers look, so they have like ice sort of skin, they have blue eyes, and the king of the Stariks is basically the king of winter. And so this is a great book to read in the winter. So there are 3 main characters who are all women. The first one is Miriam, whose father is a money lender, but he's not very good at his job. So close to the beginning of the book, she takes over for him, and she is actually really good at being a money lender and getting people to pay them back. And so her family, for one, starts to be prosperous again. Another one of the main characters is a woman whose father owes Miriam's family money, but he's not able to pay her back. And so Miriam takes on this woman as an employee. And then there's a third main character who is the daughter of a lord or something, and she gets engaged or betrothed to the Tsar. These 3 women's lives intertwine. The story is like really complex, and I don't really know what else to say about it. One of the things that I loved about the book is the atmosphere. I felt cold while reading it. You read about these beautiful snowy landscapes, and I love that. Another thing that's really interesting is that Miriam is actually Jewish. There isn't anything else in this world to suggest that it's taking place in our world, but Judaism seems to exist. While it wasn't a major point of the book, Miriam did refer to herself as being Jewish multiple times, and the cultural aspect of being Jewish definitely played a role in the story, and I found that integration to be really fascinating. I mentioned that this is a loose Rumpelstiltskin retelling, but I also saw little bits of other fairy tales in this book, and I loved seeing those little glimpses of other fairy tales. I would say the plot of the story might be on the slower side. I mean, it's like a typical adult book in my opinion, but I have heard people say that they were really bored in the middle of the story. But once I got past like a little more than the halfway mark, I could not put this book down and could not wait to see how it ended. I think this book explores a lot of different themes like feminism and family, and I loved it so much. I've heard some people say that like if you liked Uprooted, you might not like Spinning Silver, and vice versa. I personally loved them both, so that's definitely a possibility too. Alright guys, those are all of the books that I read in the last 3 months. If you've read any of these books or have any thoughts about the things that I said about them, leave them down in the comment section so we can have a discussion. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. I post 1 to 2 times a week. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. So for me, that is September, October. Crossroads of Twilight, which enhanced my experience with this. I just can't talk today because Victor Frankenstein, and I think he's really funny, and I appreciate and I think he's really funny, and I guess that's it.